And then also Zelensky recently, he said it very clearly. He said either you let us into NATO or we're going to develop nuclear bombs. And then the German publishing the Bild, I think it's said, they reported that a few months ago there were discussions about that already. So it's not just the recent something. Zelensky just the heat of the moment said something. It seems like they were considering nuclear bombs. Now, Ukraine is signed the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, which in principle is subject to IAEA inspection. Can we say then, at this point at least, that Ukraine is not developing a nuclear weapon, nuclear bombs? Can we say that with confidence?
We can say that with reasonable confidence because the Russians have said that they're able to keep track of what's going on in Ukraine with great deal of precision. And the Russians have said categorically that so far there is no Ukrainian nuclear weapons program. Now, the Russians, in theory, have every reason to highlight, to inflame this. So if they're saying the opposite, if they're saying that nothing so far like that is going on, I suspect that they're telling the truth. Also, the Russians have a very close relationship with the IAEA, with Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. They've had the IAEA inspectors visiting their various nuclear facilities at Kursk and in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And they've also got contacts with the IAEA in inspecting things going on in Ukraine. Again, the IAEA is not raising alarm bells. So I don't think this is happening at the moment. There is another possibility, and this is one that the Russians have floated, and which they say maybe what the Ukrainians really mean, which is not to develop a nuclear bomb itself, which it would take the Ukrainians at least a year or 2 years to do, but to develop something completely different, which is what's called a dirty bomb. This is a conventional bomb, but one which has radioactive materials. And this would be a relatively straightforward thing to do, apparently. And if it was used in an attack, it could create radioactive contamination over a significant landscape. And the Russians have previously, back in 2022, warned that Ukraine was thinking about doing that. And it could be that this is what the Ukrainians are thinking about now. The Russians have again said this.
Okay. Well, I mean, that sounds to me very dangerous too, right? The dirty bomb, right? They contaminate and they hurt people. I mean, they have longer consequences also, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is contamination that lasts for millions of years potentially. So it's that kind of thing. So I mean, this is not something to be discounted. It's not a nuclear explosion, but it's something pretty horrible in itself. It doesn't have the apocalyptic effects that a nuclear explosion could do. But as I said, it's pretty horrible and very terroristic and complete war crime and all that. But it is something which would be within Ukraine's capabilities and which they could probably do if they put their mind to it and assemble something like that over a period of a couple of weeks, as they've said they might. But be very counterproductive for the Ukrainians to go down that route.
Also, recently, Russia changed its nuclear doctrine. So I looked it up. So the main difference, the old one said, under what circumstances will Russia use nuclear weapons? So the old one says only if conventional attacks threaten the very existence of Russia's state, which is pretty high threshold. Now the new one, the latest one after they changed it, it says it can be used if conventional attacks pose a critical threat to sovereignty of Russia or Belarus. So it put in Belarus as well. And then it seems like more flexibility to give it to the leaders, right? Because it says the tax poses a critical threat to the sovereignty. So that seems much more loose condition, right? Is that
It is absolutely correct. It is a lowering of the nuclear threshold.
Okay.
And the Russians have made it clear that the purpose of it is to reestablish deterrence, because the Western powers are repeatedly saying that the Russians will never use nuclear weapons. And this has encouraged the West to do whatever it wants, basically, in Ukraine. And the Russians have been getting increasingly alarmed about this and are worried that eventually a situation will arise when they have no choice but to use nuclear weapons. So they are publicly lowering their thresholds in this way in order to basically warn the West off. Now, on the Duran, we had a discussion with a Russian academic, Sergei Karaganov,
Hmm.
who is a Russian professor, and he's been an advisor to many Russian presidents, including Leonid Brezhnev, Mikhail Gorbachev,
Hmm.
Boris Yeltsin, and Vladimir Putin. And he has been a major advocate of lowering the thresholds, the nuclear thresholds. In fact, the most public advocate of lowering the nuclear thresholds. And he has said that keeping the threshold as high as it had become, which was a legacy of the period when the Soviet Union had major military dominance in Europe in conventional forces. Keeping it at that level was actually dangerous and was undermining peace and was causing the West to take risks and to gamble in a way that um, was putting the world at risk of a nuclear war. And he has explained his thinking, which is the thinking that's reflected in this document, extensively in that interview that we did with him on the Duran.
Recently China conducted this test for intercontinental ballistic
Yeah.
missile, right? It seems like there are more to it. We learn more about it now. So apparently China has been pretty frustrated recently because, among other things, so Biden approves 567 million in defense support for Taiwan. This has just happened recently. And of course, U.S. is behind the crisis, the tension in the Korea Peninsula. And
Mm.
of course, they always stir trouble in South China Sea with the Philippines. It's like, and of course, Myanmar. Many Chinese believe the U.S. is behind that too,
Yeah.
and so it seems like the U.S. will never stop just circling China with all kinds of troubles and all that. So China kind of like had it, and it feels the need to warn the U.S. So
Yeah.
this is what the U.S. calculation was interesting. I read a pretty good article about this. Is that the U.S., which I largely agree, the U.S. political class, they like to gamble. They like to calculate the best scenario for the United States. So the best scenario for the United States right now, the U.S. Doctrine, nuclear doctrine is first use policy. They said that the United States maintain a policy of calculated ambiguity regarding the first use of nuclear weapons. What it means is that calculated ambiguity, which it means nobody knows when the U.S. is going to use it. They
Mm.
can use it whenever they want. So now with that, the U.S. will, of course, when they see fit, will use the first strike.
Mm.
The U.S. calculation is that now China already told the U.S. many times that we can fight back. We don't have as many war clear heads as you are, but we have enough to hurt you. But U.S. doesn't actually believe that, in the sense that U.S. believe the first strike they can take out all those stations or silos that China has. For one thing, U.S. has more deployed nuclear warheads, like they have a
Mm.
1,600, and Russia has an equal amount. And China in total has about 500 nuclear bombs, and there's nobody knows how many they are deployed, ready to go. The
Mm.
U.S. calculation is that it's not that many, and we can take them out with the first strike. There are actually people in Washington believe that,
Mm.
and then even let's say you get something ready to go after the first strike. U.S. and China is so far away. China doesn't have the military base, so the missile cannot reach to the United States. And if it's getting closer, U.S. can intercept that. So
Mm.
the test, the intercontinental ballistic test that China conducted, is the answer to all three of them.
Yeah.
China conducted this from a military truck, which means it's actually very, very flexible. It's not easy to detect. You can't easily bomb them because they can scatter anywhere they want. And then the missile can reach 12,000 kilometers, which is the distance. Definitely, they can reach United States, continental US, and it cannot be intercepted. So that's China's answer to the United States with their best case scenario. China is saying, don't even try, forget about it. We can strike back. So don't even think about it. What is your take on that?
I think you're exactly correct. I mean, the one thing I would say is you said at the beginning that China is frustrated. I think that was a very, very polite way of describing what China's feelings must be. I think the Chinese are much more than frustrated. I think what the Chinese government is seeing is a government in the United States which is reckless, that takes dangerous risks all the time, that is constantly pushing and provoking where it doesn't need to, and is always itching for a fight. And the only way to deal effectively with a country like that, with a government like that, is to demonstrate extremely strong deterrence. Ultimately, it's not so different from Russian thinking. The
Yeah.
Russians, of course, have an enormous nuclear force, which
Mm-hmm.
is a legacy of the Cold War. But they've been busy updating it as well. Again, for the same reason, because there was a lot of talk a couple of years ago about the Americans being close to developing a first strike capability. So inevitably, the Russians feel obliged to respond. And at the same time, with all of these threats and all this talk about how the Russians are only bluffing, they've been forced to do something they would not have done by themselves, which is lower their nuclear thresholds. Now, if we go to China, the Chinese case is in some ways, from my personal perspective, a deeply frustrating one, because I don't get the impression that China 5, 10, 15 years ago had any great plans to become a nuclear weapons superpower.
Mm-hmm.
I
I
mean,
agree.
the
I agree.
Americans were, the Russians were, legacy of the Cold War. But China's business was business. It was just getting on, building up China, making the Chinese people more prosperous, exporting to the world, doing all of these things. I don't think they had any interest in doing all of that. But you described very precisely, correctly, all of the constant provocations that China has to face and all of these constant discussions that take place openly in the American media about how to wage war against China. And we would discuss, was it 2 weeks ago, the American naval plan for a
Oh,
war
yeah.
against China
Yeah.
in 2027, other plans for first strikes against the small number of Chinese long range missile installations. So, what do the Chinese do? The only thing they realistically can do, which is develop their own strategic deterrent capability. And again, I suspect that the Americans, with their usual arrogance and short-sightedness, said to themselves, the Chinese won't be able to do this. We've got a long period of time before the Chinese can. It's going to take the Chinese at least a decade or 2 decades. And we see that the Chinese have already developed a capability. They have a road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile with, I think you said, a range of 12,000 kilometers, which is, by the way, I mean, I know a little bit about this, about as long as it gets with
Yeah.
intercontinental ballistic missiles. So, this changes, obviously, the military balance, not in in the US's favor. But there it is. Who's brought it about? You act in a way that provokes one nuclear superpower, Russia, to lower its nuclear thresholds, and the other nuclear superpower or potential nuclear superpower, which didn't want to be a nuclear superpower, to engage you in an arms race, because that's what it's now starting to look like, in which to repeat again, China has the massive manufacturing and industrial advantage. So America puts itself in a worse position, much worse position than it would have been if it had not done any of those things that you so clearly outlined in your question to me.
I think you're totally correct. I think a few years ago, it's true. I think I told you, right, that before the tension get really high, there were military personnel exchange, their views between the Chinese and the U.S. military retired people. And at one point, this retired general, he talked about that, their conversation. He said he talked to his U.S. counterpart, and he said, we're fully aware that U.S. can destroy China hundreds times over, but China, we only satisfied to destroy the United States once, which means that China thought, well, as long as we have nuclear weapons, that should be enough, to deter. But that the people in Washington, they don't believe that. They actually don't think China has the ability to fight back in a nuclear war. I think it's crazy, but that's what they believe, right?
Yeah.
And I think China realized that they have to do that. What you said, forced to have this competition now. It's unfortunate, right?
It is very unfortunate, and again, as I said, they are being forced to go where they had no intention of going. You have problems with one nuclear superpower, Russia, and now you're doing that. Now you're going to have problems with two. As I said, it's difficult to understand the thinking here, but there it is. I think that is the realities of this.
Don't you agree that they are gamblers? The people in Washington, they gamble, right? And then they always thinking what's the best scenario for the United States. They don't think of the worst case scenario as a gambler.
Well, they're addicted to gambling. And one of the great problems with the United States, and I'm going to say this, we have any Americans watching, they might not be pleased with me now. It is that they're a country with a relatively short history. I mean, just over 200 and whatever, 40 years or whatever it is. And a history which has been a happy history. They had one civil war, which is over a long time ago, and they've had enormous prosperity, and they've gone from success to success, and they don't have that long experience that Russia and China even more have. And that history, that short history of success, makes them reckless. They think that they can, that because, their luck has always held before, it always will. And that, induces them to gamble. Whereas other countries, Russia and China, which have had to fight foreign invaders on their territory within recent memory, know better.
Yeah. They just count on that things will always go their way. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
That's their thinking.